Hello. Now we have Mr. Uriel Araujo, a very eminent scholar and writer and a PhD candidate on social anthropology with a focus on international and ethnic conflicts. Mr. Uriel, welcome to this interview.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, please explain to us the situation which resulted or which forced Moscow in beginning its special military operations in Ukraine.
Right. That's a great question because, of course, I think first thing is any such war or military conflict or the military special operation, whatever one wants to call it, it is a human tragedy, of course. But the thing is, in the Western media in general, it's usually described as a completely unprovoked Russian action. And whatever valid criticism one may have of the way Moscow has launched its campaign, one has to understand first the general context. And if you go back to the past, and it is an interesting thing because we're not talking about the distant past, but rather about, I'm not going to go as far as 2014. If we just go to February 18th, which is a few days before the so-called Russian invasion or the Russian military campaign, which started on February 24th. If you just go back to February 18th, Ukraine on that day started a quite vicious bombing campaign on the Donbas region. And it's curious because nowadays one might even have a hard time finding it, especially in the English language press. And we have events that then become a kind of non-events, as if they had never taken place really. Because as I was saying, in February 18th, Ukraine bombed both the Donetsk and the Lugansk region, the two republics, and on at least 47 points were attacked by Ukraine along the conflict zone. So Ukraine was basically targeting its own population from Kiev's perspective, which claims those regions. And kindergarten was bombed in the Stanitsa, Lugansk town. And then on the very day when everything began, and as we can see, it not really began on February 22nd, the El País covered the humanitarian crisis there.
You know that there is a perception. I mean, everyone knows that the key reason behind Russia's beginning these special military operations was Zelenskyy's badness of turning Ukraine into a NATO launchpad through which NATO could destabilize the neighboring nations, particularly Russia. So if someone has to be made responsible for what is happening in Ukraine, is Zelenskyy. Do you agree with me?
I think the least one could say, because this is a very complex matter, but the very least one could say, and that would be already too much from the point of view of many within the Western media establishment, so to speak, is that Ukraine has both Ukraine and NATO have played a large role in the unfolding of the ongoing conflict, the ongoing crisis, because nobody wants to be called nowadays. One of the worst things that can happen to anyone, professionally, academically, is to be called a Russian propagandist or something like that. But even if you are a critic, of Russia, of Vladimir Putin, or anything like that. It's about time to acknowledge the fact that first thing, NATO's enlargement is a recipe for disaster, and it has always been so since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the second thing is that Ukraine, especially since the so-called Maidan revolution in 2014, Ukraine has an ethnic minority problem. It's not just with the Russians, which, by the way, does not include just the so-called ethnic Russians, but also Russian-speaking people, and also the so-called Russophiles, that is, the people who are inclined to have a positive view of Russia due to historical ties. Because in Ukraine, there has always been a large political camp that favored closer ties with neighboring Russia. And now, by the way, this political camp is now largely marginalized to the point of being banned. We know that recently Ukraine has basically banned all the political opposition under the pretense of banning pro-Russian agents. So a large part of the political left wing, the so-called populist camp, developmentalist forces, all of that has been banned. So we have two things. We have a domestic problem, if you will, the situation in Donbass. For instance, we know that the Donbass war began in 2014. It cannot be described just as those people there. They have their own agency in the sociological term. They have their own desires and will and whatnot. And we often describe them as basically Russian agents, Russian proxies. But what started unfolding there since 2014 and before is an internal societal conflict. It's not just about the so-called ethnic Russians and the Ukrainian nationalists, but two worldviews collided there regarding the role of the state and even some events during Second World War and also the Soviet heritage. So you have this political conflict internal to Ukraine, and then from more distant perspective, you also have the geopolitical struggle between the United States and the West in general and Russia. But in the middle of this great power dispute, you also have real people living there in their own aspirations and dreams and everything. So, of course, the U.S. has funded and aided and supported the far right in Ukraine. And of course, Russia has given its support to the people of Donbass. But the curious thing is that in a large way, Ukraine itself drove its population away. When I was in Donbass in 2019, I talked to people who identify themselves as Ukrainians. One of my friends there, I made some friends there. He said, I have nothing against he was what you could describe as a pro-Russian political activist. And he said, I have nothing against the Ukrainians because I am Ukrainian myself. My mother was Ukrainian. But he had something against the new government, the new Ukrainian regime, which the United States heavily funded and aided and supported. And
Mr. Uriel, you were mentioning about the Western media propaganda, and we know that since Russia began this military operations in Ukraine. Western media has been running a vile propaganda. And we know even they were saying Vladimir Putin has cancer, Vladimir Putin is dying, Vladimir Putin is dead, blah, 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 blah. But finally, we saw that Vladimir Putin is a healthy person and he's contesting in the 2024 presidential election. This is under such media insanity. I would like to ask two questions to you. Number one is the cruel treatment of the Russian prisoners of war by the Ukrainian regime, and also the Ukrainian regime's cruelty towards the Russian Orthodox churches. You know that Russian Orthodox churches are the worst victim of the Kiev regime. So, would you very kindly tell us about this cruel treatment of the prisoners of war and why Zelenskyy is targeting the Russian Orthodox churches in Ukraine?
Right. Well, the religions question is a rather complicated one. Most of the population in Ukraine is Christian Orthodox. And what happens today is kind of war against everything Russian, as I was mentioning before, when I was talking about political parties that have been banned and so on and on. And this is something, by the way, that's not happening only in Ukraine. In a certain way, as I have written recently, we are witnessing I call it the Maidanization of Europe. For instance, in France and Poland and Finland and Germany. In Germany recently, for example, during the Victory Day, which of course celebrates the Allied victory against the Nazi Germany and so on, Russian and Soviet flags were banned in demonstrations in Germany and other European countries, which is quite peculiar considering that the so-called Victory Day celebrates precisely the Russian and Allied victory against the Third Reich. And so this is what you have in Ukraine, because in the new Cold War, we now have the specter of Russophobia haunting most of the West. And so, for example, I don't recall in the early 2000s when the United States invaded the nation of Iraq. I don't quite recall that many sanctions against Washington or none at all, right? I don't recall people telling us to boycott or to sanction media platforms that could be associated with the United States or, Disney or McDonald's or anything like that. And after the current conflict in Ukraine, there has started a global campaign against Russia. We have seen Russian artists being canceled or banned, and so on and on with sports and everything. And now the Orthodox Church is the target because, of course, everybody knows that there is a good relationship between the Russian state and church authorities. However, it's not as if the Russian church of the Moscow uh, Patriarchate were simply the national church of Russia. This is simply not so. The way that Orthodoxy operates, it is called autocephaly. You don't have national churches such as, for instance, the Church of England or the Church of Sweden. It's not the way it operates. It does not need to coincide with the national boundaries. So the church whose patriarchy is in Moscow is not just the church of Russians. It's the church of many millions of people, including in Brazil where I reside. And it's not just the ethnic diaspora. You have converts. Uh, but now people want to target a church that can claim millions of members worldwide, as if it were just a, part of the Putin apparatus or some nonsense like that. So it is a kind of it's almost genocidal in a way. If you take today's current wave against everything Russian to its logical consequences, by banning cultural demonstrations, persecuting religious groups, that's almost genocidal in nature.
Of course. You remember that when the US President Joe Biden and actually Blinken was attending a conference, there was a missile shot on Poland. And immediately Zelenskyy claimed that the missile was shot by Moscow, Russia, while the US intelligence said no, it was not shot by Russia. So, in other words, Zelenskyy was caught red handed lying. And
Right.
Americans are still dealing with a liar, and Zelenskyy is also accused of corruption. He and his wife, we have the evidence. He is also accused of many other things. So, I mean, why United States is and the West are sending billions of dollars to a country which is headed by a liar, proven liar, and a corrupt person?
Oh, that would not be new for the West or for the United States at all, as we know. But the thing with Zelensky is that the so-called cult of Zelensky did not last very long. It's been kind of fading for a while, and right now the European Union is divided due to budget issues. And we don't know whether there will be any more money for Ukraine next year. There are many reasons for that. Quite recently, the former NATO's Supreme Commander, James Stavridis, he wrote a piece for Bloomberg, basically arguing that Washington should learn the lesson of South Korea and just negotiate a land for peace conclusion to the conflict in Ukraine. So we are seeing again and again all the signs of Western abandonment of Ukraine, so to speak. And there are many reasons for that. One of them also involves the escalation of the conflict in Israel now. Another one in Israel and Palestine. Another one involves the way that the United States can be described today as an overburdened superpower. So the United States like tries to engage everywhere. It is in the middle of an escalation of tensions with China over the issue of Taiwan. It wants to go to war. It has its own proxy war in Ukraine, and even it's not just myself that describes as a U.S. Proxy war. Even the former American diplomat, former U.S. ambassador to Finland, Earl Mack, he described it as a proxy war quite openly in April in a piece he wrote.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, and so we have many factors, and of course one of them is the fact that Ukraine cannot secure a military victory for itself, even after billions and billions and billions, even with all the weapons. And so, but the sad thing about all of this, and I do not cheer up for any kind of war or conflict. I think nobody should, even though there are just wars that are worth being fought. But in this case, it's just so sad because we now know that Ukraine and Russia could have reached an agreement that could have avoided the war, and it did not happen. It did not happen largely due to Western interference. And so, but I think, or in a way, I also hope that an agreement will be reached.
Mr. Uriel, I'd like to clarify certain things with my viewers that actually the United States involvement in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas was the subsequent result of Hamas October 7th pogrom on
Right.
Israel and abducting Israeli men and women. And also now we're seeing that Hamas has committed cruelty on Israeli women and girls and sexual violences. But in Ukrainian case, we don't find any reason for United States to intervene. Actually, as Mr. Uriel said, this crisis, this problem could be solved through um, dialogue and discussion between Ukraine and Russia. But it was United States and its Western allies, they actually didn't want it to happen. They wanted to destabilize Ukraine and turn it into a ground for threatening, particularly Russia. So, of course, what Mr. Uriel said that this Ukraine crisis can be solved through dialogue. Russia has called for dialogue many times, but it is Zelensky who is not willing to sit for dialogue because also it is not Zelensky. It is Zelensky's masters in the West. They don't want a peaceful solution to this crisis. And they have been hoping for the last, ever since Russia began the special military operation, they were hoping that Ukraine will win, Russia will be defeated, but they don't understand. It is impossible. It is impossible for Ukraine or the Western forces to defeat a mighty military of Russia. It is impossible. And Russia is having a under the presidency of Mr. Vladimir Putin. He is a very, I mean, he is the most, he is a patriot, first of all, and he is the person who understands things which serves the best purpose of his own country. So now, Mr. Uriel, we would like to ask you about these Western military assets and cash flowing into Ukraine. We know these are going into the hands of underground mafias, particularly the weapons. And those weapons, according to our information, even are being transported to Western nations and also landing to the hands of terrorist groups. So, with these billions weapons or billions of dollars landing to the hands of terrorists, don't you think it is creating a very dangerous world for all of us?
It certainly is. As we were saying before, the West has kind of grown tired of Zelensky, and I would not be surprised to see the West, or actually the United States, support. We know that the West is pressuring for elections in Ukraine, even in the middle of a conflict, and the country has declared martial law. And of course, any country would refrain from holding elections in such a context. But even so, the West is pushing for elections there. Why? Many people think that the West wants to get rid of Zelensky. He's just too unpredictable from the point of view of the West. And the sad thing about all of this is that even after the conflict ends, even if a peace deal is reached in the near future, because we know that Ukraine will not obtain military victory, we know that. But and so Ukraine will not become, in all likelihood, will not become a member of NATO. And that's the great irony of it, because we have seen all signs of it. Recently, an important member of the Ukrainian parliament uh, Oleksiy Goncharenko. He is also a member of the Ukrainian permanent delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And he has published in his Telegram channel several texts saying that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, and that according to Western sources to whom he talked in Washington, the United States right now is pressuring its European allies to no longer talk about any of that, to no longer talk about the Ukraine's accession to the Atlantic Alliance. So that's the great irony of that. But the thing is, even after Zelensky is gone, and even after the war or the conflict or whatever one wants to call it is over, that will not be the end of it, will it? Because you see, for years, the United States and the West have been funding not just a new Nazism, but the far right in Ukraine in general, the ultra nationalists, the far right, and even Nazis. And the most strange thing of all is the fact that today, such an obvious fact, if you go back to media in 2014, 2015, 2016, you will find many BBC pieces, Guardian pieces, New York Times pieces describing the Azov battalion to their regiment as what it is, as a far-right militia with many notoriously neo-Nazi members. And today we see all the swastikas and all the blatant neo-Nazi
Nazi signs.
symbol, and it
Mr.
is
Uriel,
denied.
now we know, you and I know that Ukraine is not going to be included in NATO. No way. Even there is not a big possibility for Ukraine to be included in the European Union. And we know that Zelensky has already lost credibility in the eyes of his Western masters, and West will ultimately have no option, because Ukraine has already lost the war. Already lost the war. What Western media is saying, it's all false propaganda. Russia is winning, winning, and winning. So under such situation, that Ukraine losing war and never becoming a member of NATO, and Zelensky, a person not having any credibility to any Western leaders, where he will flee, where Zelensky will flee after this war is over?
That's a very good question, because the topic of, as we were saying before, of getting rid of Zelensky has been explored for a while. I remember that a few months ago, Simon Hirsch, which of course is a Pulitzer-winning journalist, he wrote about that. I believe it was in March or April. He wrote that Poland and Hungary and other countries were pressuring Zelensky to end the conflict, to accept a peace deal, and even to resign if necessary. And one of the sources that Mr. Hirsch quotes from American intelligence said that, we can have him sent to an Italian villa or something like that. So that has been discussed. But one thing that worries me, as we were just saying, is the future, because even if the West gets rid of Zelensky, so to speak, because the United States has a history of abandoning and betraying their allies when they are no longer useless. We could mention several examples, but they might something worse may arise, because the Ukrainian far-right nationalism is an ugly thing.
Mr. Uriel Araujo, we have unfortunately reached the last part of our interview, and thank you so much. And we all of us are waiting to see the last fate of Zelensky, and I'm sure that he will not find any country which will give him shelter. Ukraine is going to again be a peaceful country with the fall of Zelensky and the departure of his Western masters, Mr. Uriel Irigaray, the PhD candidate in social anthropology with the focus on international and ethnic conflict, and an eminent scholar and writer. Thank you so much for joining us this interview.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.